Your Eminence, Matteo Zuppi, Patriarch Bartholomew, Professor Prodi, distinguished religious and civil guests. It is undoubtedly a great emotion for me to be here. This is a meeting rich in knowledge and spirituality. Peace and tolerance are universal values. They transcend cultures and religions. They are the starting point for facing the political, social, and humanitarian crisis that we are experiencing these times. Today's event, which I'm very happy to see that it takes place during the Italian presidency of the G20, is part of the noble tradition of interreligious dialogue. I'm thinking of the declaration Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council and of the World Day of Prayer for Peace in Assisi in 1986. In recent years, messages of brotherhood and solidarity have come from all the regions of the world and from every continent. Muslim religious leaders in 2007, addressing Christian leaders, identified love for our neighbor as the foundation for peace and mutual understanding. These reflections must not only be the object of dialogue between theologians, but must influence the behavior of men and women. Celebrating diversity and dialogue between culture and religions is essential for civil coexistence. We often understand it only when it's late, when clashes and violence are no longer avoidable. Today, as it happened in the centuries that preceded us. In its past history, Europe was torn by religious conflicts. Political leaders have often ordered these massacres or turned away under the illusion that this was enough to escape their responsibilities. But as I said before, in certain moments of history, inaction, not taking a stand, is immoral. Religion should never be exploited. In the worst cases, it has been used to justify violence, deprivation of fundamental rights, or even to direct popular favor towards very earthly political ends. We must oppose the terror, the subtle oppression that wants to deprive us of our values in the name of religion. For me, religion is love. And its principles should be defended with firmness, but with mercy, not with the irreconcilable hate, or worse, with war and terror. As Pope Francis said, hostility, extremism, and violence do not arise from a religious soul. They betray religion. Equally fundamental is to protect freedom of religion, of opinion, of expression, the right to freely profess one's faith and to worship in private or in public, the right to be able to convert to religion or abandon it without being persecuted, to build one's own identity based on respect and not on hatred. Today, however, we are witnessing an alarming number of religious extremism attacks and conflicts between different groups of faith. We've seen this in the horrible attacks claimed by terrorist organizations such as ISIS, in terrorist acts committed in the name of white or Christian supremacism, and in manifestation of anti-Semitism, an increasingly alarming phenomenon. In some cases, these were particularly heinous crimes in places of worship, spaces where one seeks comfort, hope, and protection from hatred. These brutal events are often used to represent a world divided between opposing communities. But one should remember that victims of terrorism often share the same faith as their killers. Fanaticism affects everyone indiscriminately. The international community and the G20 that Italy presides this year must put in the forefront as primary objectives the respect for freedoms and peacekeeping. The crisis in Afghanistan has brought back these priorities with terrible urgency. In recent days, we have been witnessing images that take us back to the darkest years in the country's history. In particular, women who in the past 20 years had regained basic rights, such as education, today risk of even being banned from practicing sports and being prevented from representing themselves in the government. As an international community, we have a moral obligation to a country where we have been present for 20 years, an obligation to provide humanitarian aid, to prevent terrorism, and to support the protection of human rights. Another duty as the West, and in particular as Europe, is to protect those who decide to leave Afghanistan. Italy has helped some 5,000 Afghan citizens escape the enormous risks they were exposed to. It was a significant effort, which we must be proud of, but which cannot end now. The European Union must not ignore the plight of these people, nor the historical significance of these events. For years, the Union was not able to build a common approach on the issue of migration, and in particular, on the distribution of those arriving and seeking asylum. We must demonstrate that we are up to the task in this crisis and to protect the values that we claim to represent. The maturity of the European integration process is measured not only in economic terms, but also in the way we receive immigrants. After the pandemic and the resulting economic crisis, today we have a unique opportunity to rebuild. We know well enough the things that went wrong, and I'm referring in particular to the social, economic, and environmental imbalances. And we know what the objective of our political action must be. The Italian presidency of the G20 has placed the pandemic, climate change, and the global recovery at the center of its agenda. We want to overcome the differences in the supply of COVID-19 vaccines. We want to reach an ambitious agreement for the reduction of emissions and strengthen the economic safety nets for the poorest countries. The G20 brings together the most important economies of the planet. Achieving these goals is our clear moral responsibility. To defeat the pandemic, the vaccination campaign must proceed expeditiously everywhere in the world. This is the only way in which we will be able to save lives, curb contagion, avoid the emergence of dangerous variants. To date, however, only 2% of the population of the poorest country has received at least one dose of vaccine, compared to 42% of the rest of the world population. At the Global Health Summit in Rome, pharmaceutical companies pledged to provide, by the end of the year, 1.3 billion of doses at controlled prices to low and middle-income states. Another 2 billion will be distributed by 2022. The European Union will donate at least 100 million doses this year. The increase in vaccine production in recent months has been such as to ensure adequate supplies to cover a significant portion of the population of developing countries. But now, it's necessary that these doses reach those who need them. In other words, there is a logistical problem of equal importance to that of the availability of vaccine production. The G20 as a whole responsible for around 4/5 of global emissions. The effects of climate change, however, are damaging for the poorest states. 9 of the 10 states most affected by extreme weather events between 1999 and 2018 are, in fact, not advanced economies. These countries have benefited less than others from our development model, but they are the most negatively affected by it. In the meeting on environment, climate, and energy in Naples, the G20 reaffirmed its commitment to contain global warming by 1.5 degrees and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We also intend to raise funding for at least 100 million a year to help developing countries in their ecological transition. Pope Francis, the Patriarch Bartholomew, the Archbishop of Canterbury, recently appealed to the international community to choose life, to also protect future generations. At the November conference in Glasgow, we must respond positively to this invitation and take bold decisions involving all states. After the trauma of the pandemic, the world economy is growing again. However, the recovery does not involve everyone equally. According to the most recent forecast, most of the G20 countries will recover the ground lost during the health crisis by 2022. But this will not happen for 2/3 of the most fragile states. The consequences for the poorest people risk of being dramatic. According to the FAO, because of the pandemics, there are over 150 million more malnourished people in the world. The G20 has proposed a package of measures to support developing economies involving the IMF and the World Bank. We have reached an agreement to facilitate debt restructuring for highly indebted countries. But there is still a lot of work to be done to increase resources, to involve private creditors who do not participate in this agreement, an agreement which so far has benefited a small number of countries. So we need to watch over the commitments already made and be ready to take more courageous ones. The duty of politics is action, preceded and guided by study and reflection. From this point of view, you, religious authorities, play a fundamental role. You have to awaken our sensitivities lulled by indifference or by calculations of convenience. Urge politicians to take coherent action with your message. In the most tragic moments of recent history, you have built bridges where terrorism and war, or as said before, the indifference had erected barriers. You have called for respect for differences and the repudiation of discrimination. And you have courageously defended the rights of communities that are victims of persecution. The proposal that you have presented in this forum, and which the G20 intends to examine, reaffirm the depth of your commitment, and they reaffirm the importance of knowledge and the importance of listening, without which there cannot be an authentic culture of diversity for the full recognition of the values that are the basis of our humanity. Thank you.